Quest, A.J. Ponder. The Sylvalla Chronicles, Quest, Prophecy, and Omens are a vital part of Thomas Mallory's secret collection. They were hidden deep inside the Whittington's library in the Greyfriars Monastery, London. When fire swept through the monastery in 1940, the collection was moved and hidden in an undisclosed location west of Wellington. It has been an epic journey to bring Fraderghast's tales out of the shadowy realm of magic and into the light. Before the story begins, I must introduce myself. I am Frederick Fraderghast, lecturer, scribe, wizard, author, notable, and Scholar of the Year in the 320th year of Our Lady. My textbooks, Quest, Prophecy, Omens, and the Sylvalla Prophecies are recommended reading for all Barnsley students. As the humble narrator of these texts, and Barnsley University's expert on cryptic prophecy and the translation of ancient text, I apologize for any inconsistencies. I can only relay as much, or as little, as my humble knowledge can encompass. The gaps, I am afraid, are lost in the mists of time, or in ancient memory, neither of which are particularly accurate at the best of times. I also apologize this overly short précis. For that, I am afraid you should look to the editors who informed me that, tragically, my 250-page summary overwhelmed the central thesis of the Sylvalla Chronicles, and that would be an unforgivable crime to history, for, as you know, this is not a simple story of when dragons ruled and heroes stalked the earth, nor is it a tale of idle students. It is the story of someone determined enough to change the world. The consequences of her actions we will live with forever. Frederick Fraderghast. The Birthday Party. Light pushed its way through the shutters and found a torrid, losing battle with the dust in the old wizard's attic. Outside was brilliant sunshine. Inside, the small beams barely illuminated Mr. Goodfellow Sr. and his son Jonathan on this, the old wizard's 150th birthday. Mr. Goodfellow Sr. looked pretty good for his age. His hair had long since turned white, his wizard's cloak had seen better days, but piercing eyes flashed over his beak-like nose, and his old bones moved around the cluttered attic with the spryness of a much younger man. He chortled out as he poured saltpeter and other dangerous chemicals into little cylinders. Jonathan looked suspiciously at the half-filled squib in his hand. Making fireworks wasn't his idea of fun. It was not something ordinary people did, and Jonathan worked very hard at being ordinary. He also tried his best to be a dutiful son. He'd missed several excellent money-making opportunities to be here today. But did his father appreciate it? No. His father had begun one of his endless rants about magic. "The problem with any endeavor is that you must begin at the beginning, and sometimes the beginning isn't as exciting as the middle or the end. That is the way of things. It takes time to learn to read, it takes time to learn an instrument, and it takes time to become a charlatan." Jonathan burst in, sick of the smell of sulphur and phosphorus, and tired of the expectation that would throw away a growing business to follow his father's footsteps as a demented butcher with delusions of wizardry. Most of all, he was sick and tired of this one-sided conversation. "How dare you?" Mr. Goodfellow Sr. roared. "I am a wizard of the—" "By the 7 gods, Capro!" Jonathan roared back, his fist thumping the table, scattering potions and flasks and little piles of powder. "There is no such thing as magic!" As if to deny his words, a firecracker rocketed upward, streaming pink and blue sparks before ricocheting off the ceiling and exploding in a shower of butterflies. Jonathan ducked for cover as they swirled around the room, their rainbow wings turning to ash wherever they landed. Mr. Goodfellow Senior glared, his eyes burning fiercely between strands of white hair, his mouth opening and shutting in pure outrage. It took a while for Jonathan to realize it wasn't the blasphemy, his careless fist, or even the explosion that had made his old man so angry. Jonathan had uttered a forbidden word, Capro. "Don't ever call me that again, young whippersnapper. Don't ever call me by my first name. It ain't right. I've told you and told you, but do I ever get your respect? No. All talent and no patience. Forget it. Just go. It's not like I haven't had enough birthdays. No need to make a big fuss over this one." Jonathan attempted to straighten his tunic and wipe the soot from his face. Sorry." "Why don't you just toe the line and take up the family business?" Mr. Goodfellow Senior asked. "It's got a long and revered tradition. It's the stuff that... oh, frag it." The old man trailed off, his voice deliberately thin. "Nobody cares about magic any more." Then, as he always did in times like this, he pulled out an old worn stone and caressed it. "I don't know why you fight so hard. Magic is power, son." "No," Jonathan sighed. "For the last time, Father, I'm not wasting my life on this nonsense. I've got a career, a booming business. Contingency." He patted his gold-filled pocket. "All you've got is the clinging stench of old meat and a large tax bill chasing you." "Keeps me fit, boy." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. What he saw was a bag of skin and bones held together by wrinkles. Someone who couldn't make money out of his beloved career and had to resort to butchery to make ends meet. The old wizard sighed. "Look, boy, you're 30, almost an adult. It's about time you started living up to your potential." "I've been an adult for 16 years. I run my own business." "Grow up." "Hellfire and damnation, I am grown up. It's not my fault you're 100 years out of date. There's no place for wizards in the modern world. Half the towns I go to would string me up at the first hint of magic. Anyway, I've got places to be, and the miles don't get any shorter standing around here playing with firecrackers." "Ignorant fool! Don't come looking to me the next time you hit trouble." Mr. Goodfellow Senior turned away, arms crossed. Jonathan sighed again, retrieved his battered hat, and made for the front door. He didn't know what to make of his old man's delusions. Being a wizard didn't make gold pieces, not when anybody could make Granny's special cure-all. Mr. Goodfellow Senior almost retorted, "That's what you think, boy. I know many ways to really eat up the miles, but you're not ready for them. You can only manage cure-all, and you don't even realize it's magic." Unfortunately, nobody appreciates a mind-reader, so Mr. Goodfellow Senior bit his tongue and kept on biting it, as Jonathan grabbed his broad-brimmed trader's hat and slammed the door, swearing under his breath never to return ever again. As he watched his son disappear down the street, Mr. Goodfellow Senior contemplated that it hadn't been much of a birthday. Jonathan was just too wayward. Always had been. Besides, the lad was right. The world had changed. The old wizard could smell it. The world had become a darker, more dangerous place for magic users, and Jonathan, for all his protestations, was a wizard. He couldn't hide it forever, not even from himself. Time was all he needed. But there was no time. Trouble was coming, and Jonathan's untrained talent attracted danger to himself, and anyone near him, like giant moths to a candle. Mr. Goodfellow Senior poured himself a cup of tea, and as an afterthought poured another for his absent son. Jonathan didn't come back, and when the old wizard went to empty the cup, a fruit fly was struggling in the amber liquid. It was not a good sign. Mr. Goodfellow Senior. Name: Capro Goodfellow. Class: less. Familiar. With some of the less savory additions, that will help your steak and kidney pie go a little further. Specialty: living, 150 years of it. Resume: has run several businesses in the meat line, all of which unaccountably went bust at the first hint of a tax collector. There's speculation that the old man is a wizard due to his making of fireworks and the loud noises that often emanate from his rooms. Of course, these are rumors designed to scare small children and should not be taken seriously. After all, what true magician would stoop to selling Granny's special cure-all? As a child, Mr. Goodfellow Sr.'s son, Jonathan, taunted a certain Dirk, a well-known and infamously temperamental swordsman, and disappeared shortly before his 15th birthday. Nobody was surprised. Despite expectations to the contrary, Jonathan turned up a few years later, having established a career in sales in a very distant part of the country. He now travels the length and breadth of the realm, hawking everything from ointments to jewelry. From time to time, Mr. Goodfellow Sr. is asked by a desperate mother to intercede with the temperamental swordsman. The only advice he's ever given is, "Tell them to run like Hades and never look back." Past: unknown. Did they even have exams in his day? Mr. Goodfellow Sr. rescued the fly and looked deep into the tea, searching for a vision just beneath the surface. He was about to give up in disgust when a flake of saltpeter drifted into the amber liquid. The tea rippled. Mr. Goodfellow Sr. gripped the table. The dark liquid bubbled and steamed. A face coalesced from its seething depths and crested the surface. It had a hooked nose, lank black hair, and storm-cloud eyes. Startled, he rocked the table, and the image shattered. Pressing his wrinkled knuckles into his forehead, the old wizard took a deep breath and looked deeper. This time a girl's face swam into view. Not just any girl, a princess, about 8 years old. Her frilly blue dress matched her eyes, and a diamond tiara perched on golden hair. Instantly he realized she wasn't a typical princess. For a start, she was practicing sword fighting with a small class of noble-born boys. Her dress was ripped in several places, and her diamond tiara threatened to slide off. Even so, her fierce determination put the boys to shame as she laid about them with her training stick. A woman entered the room, ushering in half a dozen servants. The girl exploded with the fury of a wildcat until, surrounded, she was dragged away kicking and screaming, her diamond tiara falling unnoticed to the floor. The scene slid. Time passed in the vision, and the girl grew strong and wiry, her sword ever within her grasp. Strange that the princess's parents had not yet stamped out the unruly and unbecoming behavior. No doubt the royal couple were still reeling from the fact that they had created a girl, let alone a girl with such dangerous determination and a pointed dislike of sitting still. The vision faded. Mr. Goodfellow Sr. cautiously searched for the wizard he'd seen earlier, focusing his efforts on finding a younger, less dangerous version. A young boy's face wavered and swam into view, his bottom lip trembling, his eyes wide with either fear or anger, as a man and woman, their mouths set in thin lines, thrust him into the iron grip of the Fairleigh University gatekeeper. Across the muddy ruts of a deserted courtyard loomed a hideous brick monstrosity, half tumbled down and covered with weeds and creepers, and surrounded by iron bars. Finding himself on the wrong side of those bars, the young wizard stared disconsolately at his new home. His bare feet oozed through the mud before he climbed up to the doorstep and peered into the gloom. Mr. Goodfellow Sr. wrinkled his nose in consternation and tried to ignore the smell of dampness and body odor, overlaid by the lingering and all too potent smell of overcooked cabbage. Behind its drab facade, the inside of the building was mustier and less attractive than the exterior suggested. Yet this is where the young wizard lived for many years, studying the ancient text while the other boys gamboled in the university gardens. The boy started reading some of the simpler volumes written in the ancient tongue, children's books mostly, but there was one truly remarkable tome, a treasure riddled with bookworms and delicate enough to crumble under careless fingers. It was older than anything Mr. Goodfellow Sr. had ever seen. Its uniform writing could only have been crafted by magic, and on its faded green cover it bore but a single word: biology. Mr. Goodfellow Sr. barely noticed the transformation as the brooding young man pored over the book with a feverish intensity, fascinated by the marvels flickering tantalizingly out of reach. Small changes of physique blurred over time, until suddenly the boy had grown into a man, or more accurately, a wizard. Time slowed. The young wizard stopped. His hand hovered in the air, his small eyes strained over his prominently crooked nose, his body poised as if on the verge of a great discovery. Mr. Goodfellow Sr. leaned over, his nose almost in the cup. What was it the boy intended as he sat at his small table consulting a marked passage in the book with such burning fervor? He couldn't be planning to revive a beast of old, could he? Recreating such dangerous magic was far beyond the rules of acceptable wizardry, but the temptation was overwhelming. Capro Goodfellow could feel it even through the vision. He could clearly see the words on the man's silent lips, and catch the glint of an eye as the young wizard plucked a lizard from a fold in his robe. Sphinodontidae, heteria punctata. The young wizard stopped, his lips closed, his chest expanded. "Stop," Capro Goodfellow breathed, knowing there was nothing he could do. The young wizard stretched his palm over the book. "Make it so," he said, clear as a bell. The lizard rippled and became something else, something wrong. It turned to stare at Mr. Goodfellow Sr. No longer a harmless beast, its nearest black eye reflected a face it could not possibly see. Capro Goodfellow startled, almost losing the vision. He clutched at the cup with both hands, more determined than ever to see what would happen next. A flash of magical fire lit the surface of the tea. The suddenly hot cup shattered in his burning hands, spraying scalding hot tea all over the table. Mr. Goodfellow Sr. stared at the mess in horror. There, scattered across the table, the tea leaves had formed the word quest. Mr. Goodfellow Sr. reeled back in horror. A quest? He tried to put his fractured visions together in his mind. An evil wizard, a fighting princess, maybe a questing princess, and somehow his boy Jonathan was mixed up with them. That was bad enough, but more than that, the magical fire worried Mr. Goodfellow Sr. Traditionally, fire was the sign of dragons, and power untamed. A word came to his lips, and remained unspoken. Asmugeld. For 125 years, Capro had tried never to think of her. For 125 years, he'd avoided the fate of his fellow dragon hunters. Maybe the magical fire was from the wizard. For a fleeting moment, Mr. Goodfellow Sr. felt relief. Then he realized an evil wizard, powerful enough to hurl sheets of magical fire, would be as dangerous as a dragon. More dangerous. The sheer strength of that fire was frightening. It had passed through the theoretically impenetrable barrier of the vision, and etched itself into little white blisters across his hands. A vial of Granny's special cure-all soon alleviated the pain, but the cause could not be dismissed so easily. Jonathan was about to be caught in the middle of great events, like a fly in water. Worse, there was only one way Mr. Goodfellow Sr. might protect his son. It was an extreme measure, but by the 7 gods there was nobody who could stop him, not even Jonathan himself. The Princess Sylvalla. Name: Sylvalla. Class: ruling. Familiar: Swift, her pony, might not precisely be a familiar, but he is Sylvalla's animal companion. Specialty: escapism. Resume: the princess would be renowned for her beauty, were it not for her unfashionably athletic figure, developed by pursuing aggressive masculine activities so unsuited to the fairer sex. She hails from a petty and insignificant kingdom, Avondale or something, not that it really matters. As expected in a princess, she has golden hair, blue eyes, and is horribly spoilt. If she wasn't a princess, she would not have been able to prance around with a sword and have her own way for so long. Past: killing, sword fighting, hand-to-hand combat, and archery. Under protest, she also managed to scrape through diplomacy, deportment, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Arithmetic being a fancy word for a subject that is little more than the addition and subtraction and multiplication needed to keep a household's accounts in order, and shouldn't be confused with the more advanced concepts of arithmetic and mathematics. Sylvalla stared moodily at the rain falling outside her window. She hated every drop gliding down the opalescent glass with a quiet intensity, so much so that nobody, not even her old nurse, could bear to be in the same room. Banned from the practice room for a fortnight. Again. Worst of all, it had been for such a trivial offence, wearing a sword to a banquet. Sylvalla couldn't see what all the fuss was about. The men were allowed to wear swords whenever they liked. Why shouldn't she also carry her sword all the time? Sylvalla blamed her mother. About a month ago, the Queen had taken to dishing out punishments for the slightest thing. It was a worrying sign. Instead of being her usual easy-going self, she had become far too interested in what her daughter was up to, and worse still, in making sure that whatever Sylvalla was up to was stopped immediately. It rained the entire first week of her imprisonment, so all Sylvalla could do was invent invectives with which to curse the torrent. She wouldn't mind so much, but horses, Sylvalla thought of her pony as a horse, tend to have poor footing in boggy ground. She couldn't risk it. Not after last time. Swift had suffered terribly, as a team of horse-grooms dragged her pony out of the mire with slings and ropes. Sylvalla's pride had also suffered. Everybody who wasn't pulling had gathered around to watch the muddy princess and laugh their heads off. "Not again! Never again!" Sylvalla vowed for perhaps the 100th time that day. Seething, she wondered what she should do now that her life was so unbearable. In contrast, Sylvalla's parents had been unusually happy. The Queen chinked her glass against the king's. "To a disciplined daughter," she said. "To an orderly household," sighed her father happily, drinking his wine with infinite satisfaction because he truly believed they had finally devised a punishment with the appropriate effect. This was obviously not the case, and the academic debate still rages. Was this an indication of a lack of intelligence, or a reflection of a lack of imagination? Either way, they were both discreetly mocked as fools by the rest of the court. On pain of death, even courtiers can be discreet. For everybody knew, except apparently her parents, that a bored Sylvalla utilized areas of her brain best left dormant. The dignitaries, the staff, and even the stones themselves seemed to hold their breath with the knowledge that she would come up with something worse than fencing lessons. or swords at table. Something big, something that spelt trouble in capital letters, and then forgot the punctuation. Dorothy's Getaway. It all began one moonlit summer night when an unfortunate cat brushed against Dorothy's legs. No, it began far earlier than that. Maybe it was when he gained his familiar, and his hatred of cats became an obsession. Or, earlier still, when his mother dumped him at Fairleigh University, and did not look back. Dorothy despised everything about FU. The wrought iron gates, the endless boiled cabbage, and most especially the school motto, "Education takes a lifetime." Yet that was nothing compared to his antipathy toward the school charter. The Fairleigh University Charter, to discipline the mind, to understand magic, to fulfill duty, for the good of all. He wasn't the only one who wondered why the charter even bothered mentioning magic, given that magic wasn't exactly encouraged. Even so, the doctrine of discipline, understanding, and duty was hammered home every morning and evening. The message wasn't always taken in, not in the brainwashing way intended. Late at night, rebel students would whisper that what the university wanted was duds incapable of higher magic, and that would be for the good of all. The perverse, the troubled, and those students who were simply trouble, worked all the harder to unlock their gifts. Dorothy was one of these. He had no interest in being the kind of ordinary wizard the school churned out. He didn't want an ordinary familiar. He found toads and owls, and most especially cats, revolting. Besides, Dorothy wanted something altogether new and interesting, a creature nobody else could possibly have. Enigmatic, mysterious, and alien. When a photographic drawing of a tuatara stared back at him with cold, sharp intelligence, Dorothy knew he wanted this magical creature as a familiar. Feeding it might be difficult, but the illustration showed it eating some kind of winged insect. Dorothy took the old tome, wiped the record of its existence from the library, and, eventually, read the words written underneath, the words so fatefully heard by Mr. Goodfellow Sr. in his vision. Dorothy. Name, Dorothy, E.R. Class, Wizard. Familiar, Toots, Lizard. Specialty, Transmogrification. Resume. Dorothy has access to Old World knowledge. The manuscript in his possession is known to contain pictures of a magical type of fly called Drosophila melanogaster. Repeated experiments to give these animals plus-shaped eyes, as indicated in the book, have failed. He is disliked by his peers, and his irrational outbursts and dangerous mistakes would have been taken more seriously, except that the general consensus was that he was a terrible student and an erratic wizard who should know better than to cast spells willy-nilly. Passed. His wizard finals, after he transformed a member of the panel of directors into one of his Drosophila melanogaster flies, and refused to reverse the spell until he was promoted. "Any hesitation," he threatened, "and you will all end up as tasty treats for my familiar." Even after this incident, Dorothy didn't command the respect he felt he deserved. He tried to leave the university to find his own way in the world. When the Chancellor said no, he secretly killed the Chancellor's familiar. Soon, killing poor defenseless animals became a habit. In a roundabout way, it was this gruesome habit that helped him escape. The escape began one moonlit summer night, when an unfortunate cat brushed up against Dorothy's legs. Dorothy recoiled. Not because he disliked cats, not at all. The emotion was far stronger than that, and his unreasoning hatred soon led him to being discovered red-handed, as in dripping with tomato sauce look-alike, with the very dead cat. And in that poorly planned and executed moment, when his fellow students burst in on him, angry and shouting, Dorothy understood there would be no weaseling out of this one, so he ran. The Tuatara dug sharp claws into Dorothy's shoulder as he burst out the doors and scrambled down the stairs, closely followed by a growing horde of angry students. Soon he reached the border fence. He forced himself to clamber up the wrought iron, ignoring the barbs that sank into his hands, and kicking out at his fellow students who clutched at his robes. The less-than-subtle magic of the fence enhanced the throbbing agony of the wounds. His shoulder stung, his grip weakened. Just as he thought he was going to fall into the hands of the people pulling him back, there was a ripping sound. Cries of frustration echoed as pieces of his robe tore away. A lighter Dorothy climbed over the fence and down the other side, where he stood doubled over and puffing heavily. He used the time to take stock of his good fortune. He still had the clothes on his back, including the tattered remnants of his wizard's cloak fluttering limply in the breeze, and his familiar. The creature gripped tight to his left shoulder, its long claws impaling ripped flesh, and kneading the gashes so they oozed thick red blood in a steady stream. Even so, Dorothy was glad to have the exceedingly put-out reptile. It was his one friend and companion in all the world. On the other side of the fence, the revelry began. Seeing their jubilation, Dorothy became angrier, but he had no time for revenge. Some of the students were climbing the fence after him, their expressions all too clear through the bars. Dorothy ran downhill, parallel to the road where the supply wagon regularly trundled. And as he ran through the tall grass and scrub, he counted his blessings once more, just to be sure he had some. 1, he was not dead. 2, he wouldn't have to run far before reaching the city, although this was not so much luck as a case of economics. And 3, there was a thriving port with plenty of ships for him to choose from to make good his escape. Sure of his destiny, his luck, and his entitlement to both, Dorothy approached each boat, working his way steadily to the other end of the docks. Time and again he was refused passage. 5 mages appeared. It was past time he was gone. He ducked around sailors unloading casks and saw a foreign ship, the Trusty Maiden. The sailors on board beckoned over another small group of wizards, 3 of the university's least able lecturers. What were they saying? Dorothy tried to bend the sound of their voices so he could hear their conversation, but the mages had moved on, chased by jeers and catcalls from some of the local urchins. As soon as the wizards were out of sight, Dorothy hailed the ship, heart in mouth. Had the ship been warned, or was the university trying to keep his escape a secret? He sidled closer, trying to gather up courage to say something, when the boat hailed him. "Wizard, you looking for a job?" We need a weather mage." Dorothy nodded sagely. At least he hoped it was sagely. "Indeed," he prompted, trying not to show his surprise. "A weather mage?" He hardly had to say anything more, as the captain offered a generous fee, food, and safe passage, and all for nothing more than keeping the weather in check. Dorothy accepted the offer and bounded on board the moment he heard they were about to set sail. The captain shook his still tender hand with gusto. Dorothy tried not to wince. In another port, the sailors might have been more thorough, and discovered Dorothy's knowledge of boats was non-existent. But here wizards were so despised that it was proving impossible to find any, except the hacks who'd asked them to report any wizards without the proper local documents. Wizards weren't exactly popular anywhere, but they did make sailing an old tub like the Trusty Maiden that little bit safer. Besides, they rationalized, a wizard who managed to turn up at these docks by himself in full wizard's regalia, and so fashionably tatty, must be very powerful indeed. The whole crew was delighted, especially after Dorothy told them he was ready and able to hold off the bad weather that was threatening. He didn't want them expecting too much, given he could barely turn a mild breeze, let alone a storm. Sleight of hand and other wizardly tricks impressed the crew for a while, and if anyone happened to mention the wind hadn't blown in the right direction for the entire journey, Dorothy would counter by saying he was holding off that storm. The ploy lasted until a storm arrived. Woken by the urgent calls of the cabin boy, Dorothy bounded up the rickety stairs and stared with dismay at the black clouds skidding overhead. The swell rose with stomach-clutching urgency as the storm swept toward them with preternatural haste. Runaway. Sylvalla sighed. For days she'd been bored. Now everything was about to happen. For as far back as she could remember, she'd fantasized about escaping the mundane life of a princess to become a heroic knight. Now her lack of diversions had focused those efforts, but she'd had to compromise. Unable to find armor that would fit, she'd decided to become a heroic warrior. On horse. It didn't sound quite the same, but Dirk didn't wear armor, or have a horse, and all sorts of kings called him a hero, and hired him for his skill with a sword. Mostly he was paid not to use it, a detail Sylvalla chose to ignore. Sylvalla was headstrong enough to ignore the jibes and push through all the obstacles in her path. The most difficult one was getting a suitable sword made. The blacksmith hadn't been at all obliging, not until Sylvalla had dropped a few unsubtle hints about the delicate matter of his dalliance with the delicate handmaiden, and the holiday he'd planned for her, which no one was supposed to know about. After that, he'd grudgingly made a sword that hadn't been fit for a beggar. Sylvalla had rudely told him so, as well as being ever so indelicate about the delicate matter. The less said about the second and third blade the better, not because they'd been bad swords, but because they'd not been that good either. And Sylvalla was not about to be fobbed off with a bit of gilt on a blade that didn't cleanly pierce armor. The fourth blade was flawless. Sylvalla had turned it over in her hands, feeling its grip and weight. It was nicely balanced to compensate for her slightly shorter reach and any lack of strength. She'd bound the hilt and honed the edge until it was sharp enough to cut the hairs on the back of her hand. Now she was merely waiting, using these last few hours to admire her handiwork and reappraise her planning. The sword might have been the riskiest and most time-consuming of her enterprises, but there were other items that could lead to questions, should she be caught with them. Food and male clothing, for example. And what did a princess want with scissors? Tapestry scissors, perhaps, but shears. Her jailers would quake to the seams of their pretty lace underwear. The rest of her supplies were already hiding in nondescript saddlebags under a pile of rusty old junk behind the stables. The thought of these precious items being stolen and having to do this all again near made her sick. So she tried to think of something else. Anything else. Sylvalla was dying to cut her hair, but it would be best to wait until everyone was thoroughly out of the way, particularly Nurse. There was always a good chance the old dear would pop in to say good night, or in other words, check up on her troublesome charge. Looking about, Sylvalla noticed the writing paper her mother had given her. Writing letters was a pursuit appropriate for a young lady in the Queen's eyes. Maybe that was why the paper lay unused on the dresser, with a pen and ink planted in artful vicinity. Well, it might console her mother, and Sylvalla needed something to occupy her thoughts for the hour or so before the staff began stealing off to bed. An hour later, Sylvalla had managed to write, "Dear Mother and Father, goodbye." She'd meant to say something meaningful, proclaiming her sincere dream of becoming a famous warrior, but the thought of all the courtiers laughing behind her back was too much. After another hour or so of fretting, she decided her overabundance of time had run short, and simply closed the letter with, "Best wishes, Sylvalla. P.S. Maybe someday I will return." Again, Sylvalla considered adding something about her quest to become a famous hero, but the truth was, it was kinda not to. "They are lucky I wrote anything." She placed the letter under a pillow, where it would surely be discovered, but not until morning. Stomach aflutter with excitement, she quadruple-checked her sword was well hidden under her bed, and squirmed under the covers. Forcing herself to lie still, she listened for footsteps. Some she didn't recognize, but many she did. Her parents, some of the ladies-in-waiting, and at last Nurse. But tonight, Nurse didn't pop her head around the door to check on her wayward charge. Instead, her footsteps were accompanied by another's. Muted laughter echoed softly as they rustled by. Dirk. Name: Dirk. Often referred to as Dirk the Quirk, but never in his vicinity. Class: Fighter. Specialty: Fighting. Resume: Doer of great and noble deeds. In other words, Dirk has killed an awful lot of people. Past: Fighting, hand-to-hand combat and sword fighting. Dirk liked to think of himself as a dashingly strong and handsome figure. A warrior, a fighter, a hero. But although he was strong, he didn't look like your average fighter. Scrawny as a freshly plucked chicken, and obnoxiously proud of every jutting bone, Dirk could run a marathon without tiring, and wield a sword long after your average bravo's arm would have dropped off and walked away in disgust. There were other things that made Dirk different from your average sellsword, but he easily found respect and employment wherever he went due to his professional expertise. He currently had a contract with the Kingdom of Avondale due to a prudent move on the king's behalf by one of the king's closest advisers. After seeing Dirk's sword rather too close to his own neck, the adviser decided Dirk's skill would be invaluable to the realm. It was a cozy agreement where everybody, except the odd marauder, kept their heads on their shoulders. Dirk had barely set off on his morning constitutional, a routine that began with a 5-mile run, when he heard the unmistakable sound of hooves behind him. "Now," he thought to himself, "those are the hooves of a pony, so at this time of day, about 4 a.m., the person riding it will either be a villain attempting to avoid the consequences of his or her actions, or a princess trying to escape the tyranny of her father." It was lucky for Sylvalla that Dirk thought in this peculiar way, or her blood and other important bits of her would surely have been spread like jam all over the paving stones. As it was, Dirk merely attempted to block her path, a gesture Sylvalla's horsemanship easily put to shame. Health warning. Aside. Not only are the following pages an aside, but they are also littered with footnotes and other pointless babble. As a scholar, F. Fraderghast insisted they stay. As a sane human being, I suggest you skip ahead to the next section. Or, better still, put down the entire book, lest you be corrupted, not only by the writing, but the dubious subject matter, and go clean your room like you promised. Sylvalla urged her mount. She didn't like thinking of her chocolate-brown stallion as a pony. On to greater speed. She'd recognized Dirk in passing. It was hard not to. Who else would show that much skin on such a chilly morning? And who could help but fear his reputation? Some said Dirk's sword had removed people's heads so cleanly that, on occasion, his victims had walked around for hours, until their heads simply slipped off their shoulders. Sylvalla gingerly raised a hand to her own head to ensure it was firmly attached, and smiled. Such stories might not be completely true, but they were well earned. So much so that Sylvalla's father often joked that if Dirk's reputation didn't precede him, the number of corpses in his wake multiplied by a factor of 3. Even the appellation Dirk the Quirk was no more than a natural extension of the man's fame. Bards told tales of legendary characters who'd called him that to his face. Nobody believed the bards, for who would be so reckless? And yet the name was so appropriate that behind his back he was hardly called anything else. The sight of a slight individual carrying a bloody great enormous sword, while wearing the smallest pair of leather-thonged bikini briefs in existence, suggested he was 2 walls short of a house. Didn't he ever get cold? In the past, Dirk had been called other names, but they'd never really stuck. Probably because, as a rule, most people couldn't get past the word sir, and it's true, some never made it that far, having been brutally slain well before whatever they might have said could enlighten the world. A foolish few had tried other conversational preambles, for example, nice short words like scum or murderer, before turning and running like hell. This practice seems to have ceased due to a natural physical law called inertia, which didn't seem to affect Dirk, while conveniently trapping his opponents. It may also have declined due to a lack of people that stupid. Think of it as natural selection for anyone foolish enough to think that his particularly large and vicious-looking sword might get in his way and slow him down. It didn't, and it doesn't. If you think about it for one tiny fraction of the smallest particle of time, a thoughtful scholar will realize that that wickedly sharp, if over-large sword, the one that cleaved oxygen molecules as Dirk whistled by, was a really good reason for not wanting to taunt the man. Moreover, you should know that Dirk, despite never actually competing in a race, is generally believed to be the fastest human on 2 legs. He's never failed to catch up with a victim yet, even if they're a little young to chastise properly, and it's just to tell them that their life is forfeit if he sees them after their 15th birthday. Anyway, Dirk managed to halt the sword throw that would have cleaved Sylvalla's head from her shoulders as she breezed by. Now, having successfully recognized her, he found himself in a strange predicament, caught between duty and fame. As a paid employee of the king, he should inform his majesty of the whereabouts of the princess. On the other hand, and upon a moment's reflection, Dirk realized that if he brought this bad news to the king, he would probably lose his own head. Graciously, Dirk decided he'd allow someone else that privilege. Having made up his mind, he sprinted after the princess with every intention of heroically returning her to her doting parents. So now, unfortunately, we are left with the disconcerting vision of the backside of a semi-naked skeletal figure, with a sword almost as large as himself slung over his shoulder. The entire apparition is sprinting into the dawn, kicking up a cloud of dust around his ankles. At last he turns a corner in the road, and we are left with nothing but dust and obscuring scrub, which is a mercy.